I can't tell you how delighted I was that Daniel said yes to being here this weekend. Obviously, hugely valuable to us to have his experience and intellectual capacity compete in our weekend together. It was also, frankly, an extraordinarily poignant and meaningful experience for me. So let's give a little background. I think most of you know this, but I won't assume. In 1971, after spending years gathering documents and trying to make this release work, Daniel released the Pentagon Papers, which showed how the US government and military establishment had been, shall we say, less than honest with the American people about the state of affairs with the Vietnam War. Suffice to say, this was by far the most significant whistleblowing effort of the 20th century, and some would say probably the first significant whistleblowing event. I, at that time in 1971, was a student in Boston. I was a passionate and naive 19-year-old who protested against the war and partied probably in equal portions. But then about that time, there was a draft in the United States at that time for the military, and they imposed a lottery system which gave you a lottery number which basically told you how likely you were to be drafted. I had a student deferment, so I was safe in the draft as long as that student deferment lasted. The lottery numbers were announced, and I ended up with number 9. Number 9. I thought that Beatles song was about me. So obviously it caused me to think ever more seriously and do a little bit less partying to figure out what in the hell I would do when what seemed to me that inevitable date came. I prepared for conscientious objector status. I thought in my mind, I pondered if I didn't get it, and since I was born Catholic, you don't get conscientious objector status in the United States if you're Catholic, typically. Figure that one out. I couldn't, would I go to Canada? All those things that you don't know in truth until the moment to make that decision comes. So I'm not in any way suggesting I would have been brave enough to do any of that. But those papers were released, and in so doing, hastened the end of that war. And to my great fortune, the draft was expired and was shut down a matter of months before my student deferment ended. So that principled question of what I would have done in that circumstance in the face of paying a penalty was a question I didn't face. It was certainly a question that he faced. Daniel Ellsberg at that time, you should know, was a highly, not known to the public, but was a highly regarded analyst in a sense in the intellectual military establishment. He worked at the Defense Department closely with Robert McNamara, authored some of the early nuclear plans for the United States. Very important stuff. But obviously was faced with his own concerns, and the consequence, the very obvious consequence, that with the release of those papers, with absolute certainty his career would be destroyed, and with the great likelihood, and I think your expectation, that he would spend a significant period of time in prison. Yet he went ahead and did that, and I, for one, I feel the term courage tends to be used all too casually. Courage, to me, gets closer to the Joseph Campbell definition of courage, which is taking an act of principle when you know you're going to get bashed in the head hard. And that's exactly what he did. And I just think there's a tremendous lesson in that, and I personally consider him a tremendous American hero. So, first of all, again, thank you for coming. And And I guess the first question is really following up on just that. I'm sorry, I get emotional with this. Again, you knew that you were going to face significant harm for the decision you made. So first I would like to ask, why did you decide to do this? You had a family, you had children, a tremendously difficult decision to make. And then secondly from that, and much deeper, I'd love to get your sense as to the state of whistleblowing today versus back then. But first, if you could, how did you make that decision?
Okay, now, this is an Ask Me Anything, I heard thing,
yes.
right? I have heard that question before, actually.
I imagine, I have a feeling that even as good as this audience is, I'll be very impressed if we manage to come up with a question that you haven't heard.
No, you get Ask Me Anything. There's a little prize for the most outrageous question that I get here. Matter of fact, with this I saw that AMA and I asked somebody, what is that? I said, Ask Me Anything. Maybe I should have my lawyer here tonight. But this is all deep background, right? I mean, off the record, right? Yeah. No, I've never been, I don't think I've ever been on background, as a matter of fact. Not that it would do me any good if I said I was. And nowadays, none of us are on deep background any of the time, right? A lot of iPhones in this, as Jake Applebaum explained to me, NSA gets it all, even if you've turned it off. Okay, do you know that? So, okay. For this young audience, I will answer that question. Although, by the way, I for so many years, I've preferred to say, read my book, Secrets, which actually for this audience, I do recommend that you read. A journalistic audience, I think you will be interested. Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers. You can get it on Amazon used for 1 cent. Very good condition. That's where I get them to give them away. And the movie, the documentary that was made from that, Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, which got an Oscar for the longest title. And that is also, you can get on Netflix, very worthwhile. I will summarize it, the key part there very quickly. Like nearly everyone who went to Vietnam, and I didn't hear, by the way, I have a real hearing problem, and he's going to have to relay the questions to me probably when I hear them. And I missed part of what you said, but I take it you didn't get drafted in the end. I didn't hear that.
I did not.
Yeah, good. Okay, you didn't miss a thing.
No.
But like nearly everybody who did go to Vietnam and was there more than 6 months, I was there 2 years, which was more than most of the troops. They got them back in 1 year, which again was more than enough. But nearly everybody who went there, 3 million people went there, realized that what we were doing was not going to succeed in any sense whatever. As was apparent to anybody who'd been in Vietnam and looked at what was going to happen in Afghanistan or when the insurgency arose in Iraq. This was not going to do any good for us or them, anybody. And you quickly realize that, virtually everybody realized that. Now, a lot of people, like McCain, who, with all respect, spent his time in a prison camp being very brave under torture and whatnot, but he didn't really learn a lot about the war. And he managed to believe now that air power enough would have done it if we'd done more and would do it now and we should have troops and so forth. But so there were people who said, if we did it right, you know, you could have won. I noticed, for example, when I heard the name Wikipedia last night, I decided to brave it and look at my Wikipedia entry, which I hadn't done for a year. And notice, for instance, that it said that the Pentagon Papers showed very clearly that inside they understood they couldn't win the war. The war could not be won. That's often said. Wrong. People haven't read the Pentagon Papers. On the contrary, the JCS, the Joint Chiefs, said from beginning to end, the war is winnable. We all guarantee that if you let us do what we need to do. And I won't go through that whole litany of mining and invading North Vietnam and bombing more and so forth, like McCain, that, you know, we could have won. That was what the Pentagon Papers showed. In other words, you had madmen, essentially, on that point. But they weren't wrong when they also said, what you're doing, President Johnson, will not win. They were right about that, and basically Johnson knew it, as long as he didn't lose while he was in office. He was determined, like the other presidents, like Nixon, and people before him and after, they were willing to kill any number of people and lose any number of Americans to keep from being stamped with having lost a country themselves while they were in office. Let it happen later. So I learned that was what was going on, that it wasn't going to work, et cetera, et cetera. But it was going on. And now to get to your question, by 1969, I found, to my dismay, that Richard Nixon, for whom I had not voted, but I had worked for him in December of '68 in his after the election, and in the first months of his election in the NSC for Henry Kissinger and Nixon, which I hoped would get out, just as interestingly Ed Snowden decided that he didn't need to reveal all this, going to your whistleblower thing now, he didn't need to reveal at the cost of his freedom and his life, all this stuff in 2008. He would wait for the new president to clear this up, as Obama had indicated he would do as a senator. You know, he talked against surveillance, he talked against torture and so forth. Guantanamo. And it was not until, by the way, I hadn't thought of this parallel till just this moment as I'm talking. It's quite close. It was not until he realized during 2009 and as late as 2010 that Obama wasn't going to do it. He wasn't going to carry out his promises, that he began to think of, I've got to do it myself. Well, I hadn't thought of this before, but exactly parallel. I did count on Nixon to be the one, as he said, to end the war with honor. That's what he campaigned on. And I recommended a course of action to him. I had the opportunity to do that, which you can only do on the inside, right? If you're an outsider, you don't get the chance to tell the president what you think he should do. And that's what I did, along with Mort Halpern. Extrication, et cetera. Late in 2009, in about August and September, I was told by Mort Halpern, who had stayed in, working for Kissinger, that he wasn't getting out. That I had written the first options paper in Vietnam that Kissinger presented to the National Security Council. It was his first presentation, and I drafted that. Actually, I won't go further into it. I'll just say I had drafted it. So Mort was able to say in shorthand over the air, though he didn't think he was being tapped, though he was, interestingly, one of the 17 newsmen and NSC officials who was being tapped. But he didn't know that till my trial, actually, till it came out in the trial. So we talked, but even so, we could sort of use code, and he said, it's not option 5, it's option 3. He's getting in, and he's threatening, and he's staying in, I mean. And his notion of winning the war, I won't go through all that, but clearly to me, his strategy would not succeed in the way he expected. I was sure of that from my own experience. But it would enlarge the war, it would prolong it, and the war would resume on the bombing, and more people were killed. So then the critical, I realized that. Second point, there were sort of 3 things here. Second, I read the earliest parts of the Pentagon Papers. I was talking to a very interesting young woman here, Tran, whose father was working for Diem and worked through the Vietnamese and so forth. I read the earliest parts, the so-called French War, from 1945-6 to 1954, Dien Bien Phu. I put that till the last of the 7,000 pages I read, and I had the only access. I was the only person being paid by the government through the Rand Corporation, having come back from Vietnam, to read these papers and do an analytical study of what went wrong, sort of. The government wasn't exactly obsessed with learning lessons, and I was the only person doing this, actually, and the only person at Rand. So I had them in my safe, and I put off the 45 to 50 part till the very end, because I thought, what's to learn from that? You know, many years ago. This was now 1969, so it's 24 years later. That stunned me, because I learned 2 things. One, that as the Vietnamese understood, but we didn't, it had been an American-French war from the beginning. It wasn't a French war that we replaced later on. We were paying, by the end of that, 80% of the French costs. on this war, providing the materiel, providing the napalm, providing everything. We were keeping the French in. I discovered that. And second, that although under the UN Charter, which allowed for colonies, actually, it wasn't clear-cut aggression for the French to be doing this, or for the US to be helping them. They were regaining a former colony, which, amazingly enough, in modern terms, was then a legitimate thing to do. But for Americans, the first war of national liberation in the world, anti-imperial, I suppose, for us to be helping the French doing that was unjust. It was unjustified, couldn't just. It was not a just cause, which meant to me that everybody who had been killed in that war on both sides, and this was a critical thing for me to realize, the whole time had been unjustifiably killed. That war would not have occurred without the US funding and supporting it from the very beginning. Would not have occurred, which isn't to say there was no political conflict in Vietnam, or that most people did not want to be ruled by communists, strictly speaking. But there would not have been a war without the US fueling it. So it was not what liberals and anti-war people had come to think. It's really a civil war. It was not a civil war. When one side is entirely financed and equipped and uniformed and trained and paid by foreigners, that's not a civil war. And that was true, by the way, of the Iraqi army that just folded in front of ISIS, if you want to say that. They left their American equipment behind for ISIS to take and ISIL to take. It turns out that people fighting against the independence of their country don't fight as well as the people who are fighting for the independence, even if these other people are led by, in that case, Stalinists, tyrants, people who would put on a tyranny, but they were Vietnamese nationalists who were fighting. And likewise in Iraq. Is ISIS great guys? No, Iraqis know better than that. But they're not Americans, actually. So I discovered that, and finally, almost by coincidence, I went to a conference of the War Resisters League at Haverford, Pennsylvania, and to meet people. I wanted to meet people who are living the life of Gandhian nonviolent action, which I had been reading about for the last year, having fallen in love in 1968 with an Indian woman who was Gandhian and got me interested in that. And I began reading it and read about Martin Luther King and I read the other. Here were these people now who were living it, and I wanted to meet them. And I met one in particular who was on his way to prison, to my shock, a guy named Randy Keeler, and I had just been impressed by him as one of the best young Americans I'd ever seen in the course of the conference. And when he said he was the last man in the War Resisters League office in San Francisco, because all the others, David Harris and the others, were all in prison. And he said, and I'm glad that I'm about to join them. And that was a total shock to me. And I actually was so shaken by this, having just been impressed by this guy. I was glad that the foreigners who'd come from all over the world to this conference were seeing this young American. He's the best we have, and so forth. He's on his way to prison. And I went in a men's room at the back of the auditorium, and I was sobbing hysterically for a long time, nearly an hour. And I was thinking, here is the best thing one of the best things in America, one of the young men can do is to go to prison. And my son was then 14, and I thought, I know this war is going to go on, as it was. He turned 18, the war was still going on, and sent his draft card in without consulting me, but 4 years later. So I said, it's come to this, it's terrible. And I cried a long time, and then finally I decided, okay, now what can I do to help end this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? And going to prison didn't immediately tell you what to do, or it wasn't the obvious thing, nothing held. And the first things I thought of doing actually didn't have anything to do with prison. I thought they were more effective. I would get Democrats that I knew at the high level from the Johnson administration to say to Nixon, this is not your war. This is our war. We made the mistakes that got us into here. Don't make the same mistakes. Get us out. and we will stand with you, and we'll take responsibility for it, and so forth. So you won't have a backlash of the country, no, we'll stand with you. And actually Mansfield was saying that privately to Nixon at that time. Nixon said, no, that would be wrong, I didn't know that. But the people I approached, like Averell Harriman, Ted Kennedy, a number of others, Paul Warnke, and others, not one was willing to do that. They knew it was their responsibility. They'd just gotten out of office. But they said, as Paul Warnke, who was the best bureaucrat I ever knew, said, Dan, we will be accused of having gotten us in and now pulling the rug out, the stab in the back. It would be the end of the Democratic Party. He was on the Democratic Policy Advisory Committee. Another guy who was a direct aide to Johnson said, Dan, this would be the biggest bloodbath you've ever seen, and that means you and me, Dan. I said, Harry McPherson, and I said, it's right, it would be politically bad for the Democrats. I said, but there's a real bloodbath going on right now, and I think we've got to do what we can do. Anyway, they wouldn't do it. So, like Snowden, I was sort of saying, again, I hadn't thought of the parallel. I said, that's what I really tried. And I thought it had more promise than the Pentagon Papers, which ended in '68. The Pentagon Papers didn't go into the Nixon period, which I had just learned about, and I didn't have documents on that. I'd been told, but I didn't have documents. So what can the Pentagon Papers do? Their history. Nixon will say, well, I've changed the policy and so on. So I didn't really have a lot of hope for the Pentagon Papers. But this sounded more promising, but it wasn't going to happen. So like Snowden said, okay, they're not going to do it. I've got to think of something else to do. I have the documentation now of crimes, of lies, of broken treaties and so forth. So I'll put it out. And it goes on from there. But the point was, I now was at a point when, having given up on the Nixon administration, rightly, turned out, I was now ready to go to prison for life on the basis of a very small hope that it would make any difference. And in fact, the Senate, Fulbright having told me he would put it out, Mathias said he would put it out, Senator Mathias, a Republican, he was going to be the man on the white horse as a Republican that would take care of this, backed away. They all backed away. In the end, I waited too long. I should have given it to the press right away, which is what Snowden did. He was absolutely right not to go to Congress, relating it to the whistleblowers right now. The people who went to Congress, Bill Binney from NSA, top NSA people who wanted to tell about the unconstitutional surveillance which had led them to resign. Big names here. Bill Binney, Kurt Wiebe, Ed Loomis, Tom Drake. Every one of them went through channels, the way the president has said Snowden should have done. And Hillary Clinton has said that. Many people have said that, of course. But John Kerry has said, should have gone through channels. IG, Inspector General, they went to the Inspector General. They went to Congress. Nothing, as in my case. But they had identified themselves as people who thought the program was unconstitutional. So they were suspected of having given it to the Times, which they hadn't. Which, given, from a certain point of view, I don't want to point fingers at any one people, and these are the best people, they should have done. As they've said, we did it wrong. They've all said that when Snowden came out. We did it wrong, Snowden did it right. I would say to whistleblowers right now, don't do what I did. First of all, don't wait 7 years from 61 or 64, 5 years before I gave it to the Senate. And then don't waste 2 years going to Congress, because that'll just identify you as somebody who must be removed from all access to this stuff, so you can't give it later. And third, like Binney and all those, you will be suspected of having leaked it or being ready to leak it. If we can't trust you to, in theory, it's not illegal to go to Congress on a classified basis. But if we can't trust you not to go to Congress, how can we trust you with a clearance? So they took all their clearances away, which for Binney meant immediately $300,000 a year lost for him, and so forth. So they did it wrong, in effect, but they were suspected. They were all raided by the FBI, et cetera. Snowden didn't make that mistake. He saw what happened to them. He watched that. And he saw what happened to Tom Drake, who was ruined in his life on totally false charges. because they suspected him of having gone to the Times, which he hadn't. And by the way, in this audience, I would say, there ought to be some computer people who can ask themselves, shouldn't I be trying to help Tom Drake, who is a top innovator at the National Security Agency, making a couple $100,000 a year, who is now making minimum wages at the Genius Bar of the Apple branch in Maryland. And he cannot get a job. First of all, he can't get a clearance. And you know what it's like to get a clearance, to get a computer job in these kinds of fields without a clearance. And second, who will trust him? He told the truth. He went away. He can't get a job. Actually, out of this audience, he ought to get a job, as a matter of fact. Okay, that's the answer to your question.